Our discussion today really centers on what many people recognize as that final, most profound frontier for advanced English speakers, that frustrating, tenacious C1 level plateau. This isn't a grammatical challenge anymore. It's the psychological move from merely, using English as a tool to actually inhabiting it, wearing it, as our source material so eloquently puts it, like a genuine second skin.
And that second skin analogy is so critical because at C1, the speaker has built the skeleton of the house. The structure is sound, the grammar works, the vocabulary is huge, but they still feel like a guest in their own linguistic home. Their full, messy, nuanced personality, their wit, their sarcasm, their ability to be deeply emotionally present, it just doesn't always translate with the same vibrancy they have in their native tongue.
Precisely. And that really brings us to the central question, doesn't it? How do we bridge that final, and it is a high-stakes, gap? Does achieving this kind of authentic self-expression primarily require a conscious, deliberate, systematic rewiring of one's mind and environment? Forcing the brain into these highly structured new habits? That is my fundamental assertion.
See, I come at it from a different angle. While I fully acknowledge that systematic help provides useful scaffolding, I'm going to argue that this transition is driven far more effectively by authentic, passion-led, and emotional engagement, the kind that basically bypasses mechanical effort entirely. You have to find your English voice through vulnerability, through cultural immersion, not just through repeated structural exercises.
Okay, so I feel like I need to establish why this idea of systematic rewiring isn't just, helpful, but absolutely necessary. The persistence of what we call the translation habit, that instantaneous detour where the brain hears English, translates it, constructs a reply, then translates that back into English. That is the single greatest barrier to effortless fluency. It's a cognitive traffic jam, a pervasive three-step buffer. To break this requires conscious, deliberate architecture to force the brain into a direct one-step association.
I understand the diagnosis, but my concern is the prescription. You're suggesting that to break a habit of mental rigidity, one must impose more rigidity?
It's not rigidity, it is functional necessity. We have to adopt what the material calls the architect's mindset. This is an active form of self-immersion. It demands creating an environment where English is the unavoidable default. So, consider the actionable step of switching the operating language of all your primary devices. Your phone, your laptop. This isn't about learning the word settings. It's about introducing minor but persistent friction, the sheer, annoyance of having to functionally embed terms like display, forces the brain to create a direct link bypassing that need to check back with the native language. That friction is the currency of learning at this level.
I agree that establishing a default environment helps. Of course it does. But these measures often stop at the surface. To truly inhabit the language, the motivation has to shift from external compliance to some kind of internal drive. True inhabitation is achieved when your goal shifts from "I'm practicing English" to "I need to share my passion." That shift is a far more powerful and sustainable driver for fluency because it addresses the core issue, the emotional stakes.
But passion alone doesn't eliminate a deeply ingrained cognitive habit. If you're passionate about astrophysics and you join a forum but you still have to translate every complex rebuttal in your head, that cognitive bottleneck is going to throttle your participation. Frustration will set in.
And this is where emotional fluency comes in. And I'd argue this is the true final frontier. It isn't just about grammatical accuracy. It's the capacity to convey the full spectrum of your nuanced feelings. The journey is about discovering who you are in the language, and that requires the most challenging step, daring to be vulnerable, talking about real, complex feelings, not just ordering a coffee. This commitment moves the language from an academic subject held at arm's length to a, quote, living, breathing part of your heart. If you can't trust the language to hold the full weight of your humanity, you haven't inhabited it.
That level of trust, though, that vulnerability, it requires instant access to the right words, the right structures, and that speed, that agility, it has to be trained systematically. This is why the actor's craft is so necessary. The monologue method, narrating your daily life, making breakfast, being stuck in traffic, it forces your brain to forge a direct, unbroken link between a thought and its English expression. This private, low-stakes rehearsal is the mental weight room that builds the speed you need for that real emotional spontaneity later on.
See, I'd counter that. I think the most effective learning, especially at this stage, it should almost feel invisible. It has to be intrinsically motivated. Following your genuine interests and finding a digital tribe, say, joining an English-speaking Discord server for a video game, or diving deep into a niche author subreddit. It allows the learner to participate in living communities, where English is the medium of connection, not the subject of study. The learning becomes effortless because the focus is on the shared passion, making the language acquisition itself sort of secondary.
Okay, so we both agree that the internal translation buffer is a critical obstacle. But if you don't actively dismantle it through conscious training, using methods like that monologue method or limiting yourself to English dictionaries to stay inside the English ecosystem, how can the brain ever develop the mental speed needed for the rapid-fire exchange of a real conversation? It seems logically unavoidable that the foundational cognitive connection has to be solidified first, regardless of what community you join.
My primary concern with relying on constant internal narration is that it risks generating a kind of artificial, overly constructed, or performative English that doesn't flow from a genuine impulse. It forces you to operate within these pre-chewed linguistic concepts. A far more effective cognitive approach is thinking in images and concepts, not words. You aren't translating a pre-built sentence. You are visualizing the concept. Imagine, for example, a project delay. You picture the obstacle, the furious client email, the frustrated faces of your team. You then describe that complex picture directly in English. This concept-first approach is much more organic. It bypasses the translation step by focusing on the underlying reality, not the linguistic label for it.
I see the appeal of that, I do, but the monologue method is the training wheels, or maybe the scaffolding that builds the very agility you're describing. It forces that connection repeatedly in a safe space until it becomes automatic. If you rely solely on concept visualization, what happens when you're under pressure, or you're exhausted, or you're dealing with a topic you haven't recently visualized? The brain defaults to its path of least resistance, which is the native language. The monologue practice prevents that default. It reinforces the semantic web every single day.
That raises a critical question, though, for your systematic approach. The value of this artificial immersion versus genuine cultural exploration. The material discusses creating an architectural blueprint, which includes things like relabeling every physical object in your house, mirror, faucet, or keeping an all-English shopping list.
And those steps are crucial.
But are they? For a C1 speaker trying to achieve deep inhabitation, these steps feel profoundly elementary. They might expand your domestic vocabulary, sure, but they do very little to prepare you for the high-level, context-rich language required to express your full humanity. Doesn't the explorer's journey provide significantly more valuable context? I mean, engaging with niche expert content, listening to an advanced podcast on astrophysics, or watching a documentary on Indian cuisine, that provides sophisticated vocabulary that carries specific cultural weight, vocabulary you will simply never find on a refrigerator label. That's where high-level inhabitation is built.
The friction from the architectural blueprint isn't aimed at expanding esoteric vocabulary. It's designed to force a habitual bypass. It ensures the brain jumps that translation step daily in numerous low-stakes environments, reinforcing the cognitive architecture. And this architecture has to be stable before you can really embark on the explorer's journey.
So why is a specialized astrophysics podcast less valuable than labeling the kitchen sponge?
Because the architectural steps are about making English routine, not specialized. And we have to consider the utility of small, low-pressure interactions, what the source calls the weak ties principle. This means reflexive use of the language in situations like ordering coffee in English or leaving a thoughtful, brief comment on a YouTube video. These interactions, while simple, provide vital, low-pressure feedback and reinforce that foundational architecture.
That's what you need before you attempt the deep cultural dives of a niche forum where the stakes and the potential for humiliation are much, much higher.
That's a compelling point about the stability of the foundation, but I fundamentally believe the primary driver of progress here is the emotional return. It's the feeling of identity expansion, not just mental speed.
Well, let's discuss that driver, confidence. My systematic practices lead directly to the mental agility you need to bridge that gap between professional and social English. We see this perfectly in the case of Fatima, the pharmacist. She was utterly fluent in technical medical terminology. I mean, she could discuss drug interactions in detail. Yet casual chit-chat, the simple social code of small talk, felt like this insurmountable barrier. She was constantly searching for phrases for simple comments about the weather.
She was proficient but not present.
Exactly. Her systematic monologue method practice gave her the mental speed to handle those common, unpredictable social interactions. Topics she had practiced dozens of times in her head. These small, successful verbal deployments built her confidence exponentially and finally allowed her to crack the social code. Agility, cultivated through practice, led directly to authentic confidence. She constructed her social self.
Mental agility is undeniably valuable, but it's not enough if your personality flattens out in the process. The ultimate goal is to feel the language is, quote, strong enough to hold the full weight of your humanity. You can be quick, but if you don't feel like you when you speak, you're still just performing. I mean, look at the case of Javier, the graphic designer. His challenge wasn't speed in technical meetings. It was his inability to convey his dry, self-deprecating wit in team lunches. He felt he'd sacrificed his personality for proficiency.
Right, a very common C1 symptom. So how did he break through?
His breakthrough came not from repetitive linguistic practice, but from finding his cultural and emotional bridge in a local English-speaking hiking club. He formed genuine friendships built on shared, high-stakes experience on the trails. It was in those unguarded moments, sharing exhaustion and small victories, that he gained the colloquial language, the idioms, and critically, the specific cadence and humor of his colleagues. He was forced to be vulnerable.
I see why you think that, but he still needed the language tools to connect with them on the mountain in the first place. Otherwise, he would have been left behind linguistically.
He gained the essential language of friendship through shared experience, which then seeped into his life at the office. True fluency, the deep inhabitation we're talking about, stems from the ability to express the authentic self. His confidence was rooted in genuine human connection and acceptance, which is a far more powerful engine than confidence gained solely through mental speed drills. The language became a medium for his life, not a subject of study, and that is the ultimate goal.
I would argue the monologue method is just a private way of allowing that authentic self to emerge by removing the structural constraints of translation. You have to construct the mechanism, the cognitive agility, before the true self can use it effortlessly. The passion you describe as the fuel, absolutely, but the systematic rewiring is the engine necessary to use that fuel efficiently. Without the engine, the fuel just sits in the tank.
And I would argue that engine has been running since A1. At the C1 level, the engine is tuned. The challenge is the destination. The architect's blueprint should be seen as a support structure, but the engine driving this final push, the shift from competence to character, it has to be passion and emotional vulnerability, pushing you toward that authentic cultural connection.
To summarize my perspective then, the move to a habitation is fundamentally a conscious process of construction. The C1 plateau persists because native cognitive habits are just too strong to be overcome passively. Without deliberately designing one's environment through the architect's blueprint, and without actively breaking the internal translation habit with the actor's craft, one will remain stuck, wielding English merely as a tool. You have to actively rewire the foundation.
And I'm sorry, but I just don't buy that the architecture once built is the primary driver. The true test of inhabitation is emotional and cultural. The systematic strategies should be viewed as support structures for the core, internal drive. Finding one's passion-driven community, the digital tribe or Javier's hiking club.
and daring to be fully vulnerable within it. That authentic engagement ultimately allows the language to become, as the source material beautifully puts it, a room to be entered and personalized, where you can safely house your full identity, rather than just a road to be traveled.
What's clear from our material is that both the structured methods and the passion-led strategies offer critical, personalized pathways forward. The advanced learner seems to require both self-discipline and self-discovery.
Yes, the journey really requires finding the precise intersection where the vast global landscape of the English language meets the unique personal map of one's own life.
There's clearly much more to explore in this material regarding how we transition from proficiency to identity within a second language.